Hi, I'm Gareth from Park Cameras, and today we're going to run through 5 tips for shooting Christmas food photography. Alright, so tip number 1 is all about lighting. Now there's 2 different ways that you could light your scene with the food. The first way is natural lighting. So that would be to set up your food, set up everything near a window and get natural lighting coming in through the window. So you just use daylight, it's going to be diffused probably by the window. If it is a particularly harsh sun day, you could put a bed sheet up over the window just to soften that light, just to get it nice and soft so when it comes on the food, it's not creating really harsh, dramatic shadows. But the good thing about this time of year with winter is there's often a lot of cloud, and that means that it is nicely diffused already. Coming through the window, even more so. So that is a great way to be able to shoot your food photography, just using that natural light. It's a nice side light and it's very soft and just looks really great. Now the downside of it being winter is there's not as much light. The sun goes down much earlier, so if you want to shoot in the evenings or even just late afternoon, the sun's already gone, it's already dark. So the other way you can light your food is with an artificial light or with various lights. So something that I do a lot is use an artificial daylight lamp diffused with a softbox. Now you could diffuse it with again, anything like a sheet, anything to just soften that light, but a softbox works really, really well, and you get a nice spread of light. So you get a good amount of light on the food with nice soft shadows as well. Now I like to position the daylight lamp at an angle over the food so that it's kind of mimicking the effect of the sun and of daylight coming in through a window. So you kind of get that natural light feel, even though it is an artificial light. And the advantage, obviously, of having an artificial light is that you can move it around, you can play with how things look, and you're able to do it away from a window, so where maybe there's more space and things like that. So you've got a little bit more flexibility there. The other thing is you can also set up more than one. So you can have one main light off to one side at an angle, giving you nice soft light over your food, but you can have another one filling in on the other side if you don't want too much shadow in there. Alright, so tip number 2 is all about angles and how you're going to shoot the food. So there's 3 main angles that I use when shooting food. The first one is top down, so that's where you have the camera right over the top of the food facing straight down. Now this is great for shooting with things like mobile phones or anything like that, or smaller cameras, because it's actually really easy to just pop your camera over the top, and when it's lit properly that can look really good. It's perfect for food where the garnish is on the top and you've got a lot of detail on the top that you don't want to miss out on. That can look really, really nice. It's also easy to set up a nice setting for the food and get a really lovely photo. Now the second angle that I use is a little bit further down, so you can still see the top of the food, but you can also see a bit of the side as well. So it's kind of a 3/4 angle. Now this can look really good for when you've got detail on the side and the top. You can get a bit of the texture of the food as well, which is really nice. And this allows you to play a bit more with the depth of field. So because you've got a bit more of a background and a foreground, as opposed to just one sort of flat image, you can play a little bit more with what's in focus, what's not in focus, and actually draw your viewer's eye to whatever you're trying to focus in on. And then finally, the third angle that I use is just a straight side-on image. Now, I use this a lot for shooting drinks, if you want to get the texture of the drink, or for example, in this shot, pouring milk into an iced coffee, you get that really nice swirly look to things, and really you're only going to maximize that by shooting side on. You could also do the 3/4 angle as well if you want to get a bit of that top with the ice, but otherwise I love shooting side on for things like that, where you're going to get textures and shapes and things like that. And again, because you've got a foreground and a background, it allows you to play a little bit with the depth of field and what's in focus and draw your viewer's eye. Alright, so tip number 3 are the backgrounds and the surfaces that you're going to shoot your food on. Now this plays a massive part in the overall picture, and it's actually a huge part of food photography. So whether you're shooting on a light or a dark surface, whether it might be wood, whether it's a really flamboyant color, it says a lot about the kind of shot you're doing and the food, and it can really contextualize the food there as well. So for example, if you have homemade cookies on a wooden surface, or homemade mince pies or something like that on a wooden surface, it's going to look more rustic and more homemade and more homely, and it's going to have that kind of feel. Whereas if you go for like a high-end cocktail, a Christmas cocktail on a really colorful surface, that's a very different kind of shot. But you could also then shoot the same things on different surfaces. So you could bring the cocktail over to a wooden surface, and it's going to change the feel of the shot. And the mince pie is on a colorful surface, again, very different kind of shot. So that's a big part of what you're doing, is actually the surroundings around the food is going to be a big part of it. So those surfaces, you want to have ideally a few different options, so different types of wood, different colors, cloth, textures, that kind of thing, just to be able to maximize the potential of your image. And similarly to that, tip number 4 is all about styling the scene and the food, and this is actually a completely different skill. This is a skill completely by itself, which people can just be complete masters of. So you don't want to just have a mince pie by itself, that's kind of boring. You want to have it on that nice surface we were talking about, and then you want to add some things into the frame. So if it's a mince pie, for example, you might want to have some Christmas themed objects, so maybe some holly, some berries, some tinsel even, some baubles, some Christmas lights, anything to kind of just make the scene more interesting, kind of tell a bit of a story with what's in there as well. It just makes it a much, much better image. Similarly to that, if you've got an iced coffee drink, so we were shooting the Bailey's iced coffee drink, you could have the bottle in the background, you could have some milk off to the side, you could have the ice, the coffee beans, you can have a tea towel or anything like that, just to kind of liven up the scene, make it a little bit more lively, vibrant, give it a bit of life to it. And it just really changes the whole picture, makes it much less boring, much more interesting, and you can kind of play around with depth of field with this as well to get a really nice scene. It is important to mention though that you're not trying to make it look messy. You don't want to have that messy look to it, but you want to have a slightly livelier look to it than just a dead, here's an image of a drink, here's an image of a mince pie. You want to have a bit more going on and a bit of interest in the picture. Alright, so tip number 5 is all about camera settings. Now we'll start with aperture. Now when I shoot food photography, I often like to shoot with a nice fast aperture. That's because I like to keep a relatively shallow depth of field so I can have the background a little bit out of focus and have whatever the key thing is in the image in focus, so it kind of draws the viewer's eye and you get a really pleasing image. However, that being said, I don't always shoot like that. Sometimes I will stop down something like f4 or even f8 or something like that if I need to have a deeper depth of field to have more in focus. So if I'm setting a whole scene, or if I'm shooting top down where I'm not going to have a separate background, I'm going to shoot with an aperture like f4, f7.1, f8, something like that, to have more in focus, to make sure that things are in focus that should be in focus. Now, when it comes to ISO, you want to try and keep that as low as possible. So I'll usually shoot around ISO 100 or ISO 200 because I don't want to introduce any excess noise into the image if I don't have to. And I really don't have to because there's probably not a lot of moving objects in the scene unless you're doing something like a pouring shot, in which case you will have some moving objects, so you need to start thinking about shutter speed. But generally I'll try and keep ISO as low as I can to keep the image as noise-free as possible. So for shutter speed, I like to try and shoot at about 1/100th of a second. That enables me to mostly shoot handheld, and I can usually let enough light in then to get a nice bright image. However, sometimes I do need to shoot at a slower shutter speed, so I'll often use a tripod to steady the camera and something like a 2-second timer on the camera just to make sure that when I press that shutter, there's no handshake when I'm doing that. Now, when I'm doing a slower shutter, I'll often do something like 1/10th of a second, 1/5, 1/3, depends how bright I need the image to be, but unless there's moving objects in the frame, then you don't really need to worry too much. Now, moving objects could be something like sprinkling icing sugar onto the mince pies, pouring custard, pouring a drink, in which case you do want to have a faster shutter speed to try and freeze that action, unless you want a bit of motion blur. But that's a creative choice, so that's something to determine while shooting. If you want to have those items frozen in motion, you're going to want to be using a faster shutter speed, in which case you need to think about how you're going to get more light into your camera, whether you do make a compromise and put that ISO up to something like ISO 400 or 800 and just deal with the extra noise in post, or if you've got a decent camera, then you might have a situation where that doesn't really add in too much noise, which is good. One thing I would always say it's worth doing though is shooting in RAW. So if your camera allows it, always shoot this stuff in RAW, because that means that later in editing you can adjust things like color temperature and highlights and shadows. You've got much more room to play around and pull things back, and that's really important. You can get the image you want. So probably goes without saying, but definitely worth shooting in RAW as long as your camera allows it. Now, as a bonus tip, it's sometimes worth adding a human interest into the frame. So whether that is something about pouring in milk into the coffee, or pouring custard onto something, or sprinkling that icing sugar, you could just have a hand, you could have a face, you could have a bit more, but sometimes a hand and an arm is enough, or anything like that. But it just gives a human interest to the image, makes it a little bit more dynamic, gives you a little bit of a narrative to things as well. It can add a lot to an image, so it's worth exploring that sometimes. It's worth exploring adding that into the frame because it can add that extra dimension and just tie things together. So those are our 5 tips plus a bonus tip on shooting Christmas food photography. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions, pop them down in the comments below. If you like the video, make sure to hit the like button. Make sure to subscribe if you're not already. I'll see you in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.